Welcome to episode 6 in our series on Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto's The Way of God. And we are up to chapter 5, and chapter 5 deals with the spiritual realm. So the Ramchal is going to very logically and clearly categorize the spiritual realm and how it's directly connected to our physical plane and how we have an influence on this chain. It's a fascinating chapter, even though it's very deep and quite esoteric and quite difficult to understand. Something that's so abstract is almost, how can we accept it if we cannot even imagine these forces? But they exist, so we must learn about them, and the Ramchal will do an amazing job in describing these planes of existence with their angels and even their demons and the various transcendental forces. So we start, the Ramchal begins. Creation in general consists of two basic parts, the physical and the spiritual. The physical is that which we experience with our senses, and this in turn is divided into the terrestrial and the celestial. The celestial includes such heavenly bodies as the stars and their planets. The terrestrial includes everything in the lowest sphere, the earth, water and atmosphere, and every detectable thing they contain. The spiritual consists of all entities which are not physical and which cannot be detected by physical means. These in turn are also divided into two categories, souls and transcendental beings. Souls comprise a class of spiritual entities created to be put into physical bodies, to be joined and strongly bound to these bodies, acting upon them in order to perform various functions in them at different times. Transcendental beings comprise a class of spiritual entities that are not created to be put into physical bodies. These in turn are also divided into two categories. The first category consists of forces or kochot, and the second of angels. These transcendental beings also exist on different levels, each type having its own laws and distinct nature depending on its level and place in the general scheme. So great is the variation between different angel types that each group can be called a different species in a general class. This general class is the angelic. There is, however, another class that is like an intermediate between the spiritual and physical. This consists of entities that cannot be detected by physical means and are not bound by the limitations and laws of ordinary detectable matter. For this reason, they might improperly be considered spiritual. Their essence, however, is very different from that of the angelic class, even though they may resemble them in some ways. These entities also have specific attributes and unique limitations based on their true nature. They are therefore considered as a separate class, namely that of shedim or demons. This class also contains certain individual types, where each type may be considered a separate species belonging to the general class of shedim. Now the Ramchal is going to describe how man and the animal worlds share a very similar but very different type of soul. So the Ramchal continues. Of all the things that exist, however, only man alone consists of two absolute opposites, namely a spiritual soul and a physical body. Nothing else in all creation shares this quality. One must be careful not to erroneously consider that other animals are the same as man in this respect. Although animals do have a soul, it is not a spiritual entity. Although an animal's soul may be the most ethereal of all physical entities, it still does not enter the realm of the spiritual. Man is also a living creature, and therefore also has a similar animal soul. Besides this animal soul, however, man also has a higher soul. This higher, godly soul is a separate entity, completely different from the body and far removed from the physical. Only by virtue of God's decree is the higher soul able to reside in man's physical body, for the purpose outlined in the previous chapters. And I think the Ramchal here is differentiating the two types of soul, the godly soul, which is the neshama, and the enlivening soul, which animals and humans share, which is the nefesh. Now the Ramchal is going to describe how our knowledge of these spiritual entities is limited, and obviously because they are invisible in most cases, or in all cases, I think. So the Ramchal continues, we are well aware of physical things, and their natural properties and laws are well known. Spiritual concepts, on the other hand, are outside of our realm of experience, and therefore cannot be adequately described. When we speak of spiritual entities and phenomena, we must therefore rely completely on the traditions handed down to us. One of these fundamentals is that everything in the physical world has a counterpart among the transcendental forces. Every entity and process in the physical world is linked to these forces, following a system decreed by God's wisdom. These forces are therefore the roots of all physical things, and everything in the physical world is a branch and result of these forces. The physical and the spiritual are thus bound together like links in a chain. We also know from tradition that every physical entity and process is under the charge of some type of angel. These angels have the responsibility of maintaining the natural order, as well as bringing about changes according to God's decree. The existence and state of being of the physical universe thus emanates from these highest forces and are dependent upon them. Whatever exists in the physical world is a result of something that takes place amongst these forces. This is true of both what exists in the beginning and what transpires with the passage of time. These forces were the first things created, and they were arranged in various systems and placed in different domains. Everything that came about later was a result of this, following rules willed by God, linking these forces to the physical world. Everything that happens in the past or present thus has its origin in processes taking place between these forces. The existence, state, pattern, and every other quality that exists among these forces are a result of what is relevant to them by virtue of their essential nature. The existence, state, arrangement, and other phenomena involving physical things in turn depend on what is transmitted and reflected to them by these forces, following the essential nature of these physical entities. So if I'm going to pause there for a second and perhaps try and bring an analogy to these forces. I think these are different from angels. These are forces, primal forces. Perhaps it can be likened in some way to gravity, perhaps as one of these forces. When you imagine that a tree or a plant, it has a force pushing it upwards towards the sky. That force is tempered or opposed by the force of gravity, which limits the height that it can grow to, because it has to fight against gravity. Now, these two opposing forces create the shape of the plant or tree. If you imagine the two opposing forces, a tree without gravity would grow continuously. It wouldn't stop. Nothing would oppose its pushing out from the earth. But perhaps this is a good analogy of how these forces combine to create on this physical plane. And now the Ramchal is going to describe how we, human beings, can freely choose between good and evil. So the Ramchal continues. According to this principle, every physical phenomenon originates among these highest forces. There is, however, one exception to this rule, and that includes all things that depend on man's free will. God willed that man should be able to choose freely between good and evil, and therefore made man absolutely independent in this respect. Man was thus given the power to influence the world and its creatures in any manner his free will desires. The world therefore contains two opposite general influences. The first is that of natural determinism, while the second is indeterministic. The deterministic influence is directed downwards from on high, while the indeterministic is directed upward from below. This is because the deterministic is the influence that stems from the highest forces, and therefore when it is directed towards our material world, it is directed downward. The indeterministic influence, on the other hand, is the result of man's free will here in the physical world. Since both man and his actions are physical, the only direct influence that he can have is on physical things. Because of the linkage between the physical world and the highest forces, however, every time a physical thing is influenced, it also has an effect on its counterpart amongst these forces, since man's deeds in the world below are what influence these forces on high. Man's influence is said to be directed upward. It is thus the exact opposite of the natural deterministic influences. It is necessary to know, however, that even man's deeds are not all the result of his free will. While this is true of most of his actions, there are some that result from a divine decree to reward or punish him, as will be discussed in detail in a later section. Such decrees take place in the same manner as other natural phenomena, where the influence is directed downward from the highest forces. Nevertheless, even in such cases, the elements resulting from the individual's own free will are still directed upward in the manner discussed earlier. God arranged things so that every matter falling within the realm of man's free will should be able to affect the transcendental forces through this indeterministic influence according to the measure and degree set forth by God. This is true not only of man's deeds, but even of his speech and thoughts. The amount and degree of this influence, however, cannot exceed the limits decreed and circumscribed by the highest wisdom. Every indeterministic influence, however, also results in the deterministic influences. When the highest forces are influenced by man's free will, they in turn influence the physical things that are inherently linked to them. All these processes, however, follow many detailed laws, and decreed by the highest wisdom as being best for creation. Both the ways through which man's influence reaches the highest forces and the manner in which these forces react towards the physical world all depend on many factors. All this constitutes the deep mystery of how God's providence works and brings about everything that was and will be. So, just to pause there for a second, the Ramchal is describing this kind of, how I imagine when I'm learning this, is a kind of Jacob's ladder of events and influences. God influences the mind of man. The mind of man has free will to do with that influence as it wishes, and perhaps does something good. And this feedback loop from man back, like the ladder going back to heaven, the spiritual chain that the Ramchal described, affects something in Shamayim. God is perhaps pleased with a positive action that came about from an initial deterministic flow from above, but was reciprocated by another positive flow from below. And this affected the spiritual realm. And then perhaps this chain of positive events would occur in the world. This loop that was go from Shemayim to our plane back again. It can also be the reverse. It can also be that man acts in a wholly bad way, and it can affect Shemayim in a bad way, and resulting in another feedback loop to correct man on this existence. So this is very interesting. This seems to be this holistic, like a oneness to our actions and thoughts, as the Ramchal describes, this feedback loop. Now the Ramchal is going to describe how good and evil on earth are rooted in good and evil in the spiritual realm. So the Ramchal continues. As discussed earlier, God's wisdom decreed that both good and evil exist in the world. Like all other things, these concepts must begin among these fundamental forces and then have effects in the physical world. God's wisdom arranged the transcendental forces, the roots of all that was created, and set them in an order and system in which it would be possible that there should pertain to them either rectification or tikkun, or spiritual damage, kilkul. They therefore have states that are good and otherwise. The essence of a state of good is when a force has the capacity to be illuminated by the light of God's presence. The opposite state is that which lacks this capacity, and where this light is therefore withheld from a given force. The result of the rectification of these forces is everything good that exists in the physical world. Its converse is the opposite. It is necessary to realize that the true cause of everything, goods, whether amongst the forces or their effects, is the light of God's presence. The cause of all evil, on the other hand, is the absence of this light. With regard to good, however, God is considered its actual cause, both in general and in particular. God is not considered the direct cause of evil, on the other hand, and we are thus taught that, and I quote, God does not relate his name to evil. God is nevertheless still the indirect cause even of evil, since its actual cause is the absence of good, and it therefore results from the absence of God's light and the concealment of his presence. No bounds or limits can be placed on God's omnipotence, and therefore there is nothing preventing him from creating even evil if he desires so. In order for the various concepts of evil to exist, he created a particular root and source. The purpose of the source of evil was to give rise to particular concepts, to the extent that the highest wisdom determined necessary, so that both man and the world be in its desired state. Regarding this source of evil, the scripture states, and I quote from Yeshayahu chapter 45 verse 7, God forms light and creates darkness, makes peace and creates evil. This source of evil includes many different forces, from which all concepts of deficiency and evil originate. It can affect both body and soul in all their various categories, and we will discuss this further in the second section. In general, the activity of these evil forces, both individually and as a whole, depends on the extent to which God's light is absent and his presence concealed. The greater this absence of light, the more authority and power these forces have to act, both in general and in particular. When these evil forces gain power and authority, the force of good is weakened, and those forces which are the roots of all created things are damaged. This in turn weakens both the forces of their derivative branches, which are the physical things associated with them. When these evil forces are subjugated and deprived of their authority and power to act, on the other hand, then the good becomes strengthened. The roots of all created things are then rectified and are set in a good state, so that both they and their branches are strengthened. Everything therefore depends on the strengthening of these forces, whether it be the concepts of good and evil, the battle between the physical and spiritual, or other matters of perfection and deficiency. When either the force of good or that of evil gains power, its qualities and effects influence all created things, both through their roots and their branches. When either one is subjugated, on the other hand, its activity is nullified, and its attributes and effects are removed from the roots and branches of creation. There are many levels amongst the qualities of these evil forces and what results from them. In general, their effects are called corruption, tumah, darkness, pollution, zoma, mundane, chol, and the like. Things resulting from the illumination of God's presence, on the other hand, are called holiness, purity, light, blessing, and the like. These are all general categories. When we consider their elements, however, we are able to distinguish the specific categories and details of these general classes. Around these revolves all of God's providence, through which He directs His world. For each one of these concepts, however, there are agents or overseers belonging to the general class of angels, appointed to translate them into action in the physical world. This is true of both good concepts and their opposites. These angelic agents are God's servants, obeying His words. God willed and organized things so that His decrees should be translated into action through angels, each in its own appointed area of influence. So that concludes the 5th chapter of the spiritual realm. That's a very, very deep and esoteric subject. And the Ramchal beautifully describes, quite lucidly, the structure on which this invisible realm stands. And most importantly, he stresses that and I quote this, everything therefore depends on the strengthening of these good forces to maintain the balance of good and evil, and a positive balance of good over evil. So as much as we learned these complicated structures of links of angelic and transcendental forces, they seem quite out there and beyond our reality, but in effect they are absolutely within our own hands, because we as human beings have the free will and choice to perform positive good acts that affect this whole chain, this spiritual realm, as well as this physical realm. We are taught, we read every day, Shema, that if we do the right thing, if we live according to if we keep God's commandments, the grass will grow and our animals will be fed, and we will live well. But if we don't, if there's an absence of the light, or we cause an absence of God's light through our negative actions, then the exact opposite will occur. So God is laying it out to us, black and white, literally black and white, the opposites of each other. That if we do good, things will be good for us. This feedback loop, this spiritual feedback loop, will be to our benefit. If we just do the right thing, it's not difficult. So that was a fascinating chapter. And in the next episode, we're actually moving on to the second part. The first part was the fundamentals. Now, the second part, the next episode, is going to deal with providence. So that should be fascinating.